for the time to explore that field between ethics and digital theology a little under the headline Prophetic Critique and Digital Theology, exploring the potential of digital communication to make the voice of the least heard. So I'm touching a topic that we've already talked about and Ilona Nord has earlier commented on. And I'm reporting from an ongoing project and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments on my ideas and impulses. But let me start. Robert Geisendörfer, long German name, Robert Geisendörfer was one of the people who rebuilt the institution of Christian communication in post-war Germany. A longtime director of Protestant Press Association for Bavaria, a co-founder of magazines and a movie company, and then the first director of the Gemeinschaftswerk Evangelische Publizistik in Frankfurt, an association for Christian communication in Germany. In 1974, he summarized his program for Christian communication with two buzzwords: freedom and advocacy or deputyship. On the latter, he wrote, quote, "Because the church is so free to work with the freedom of God's children, she has the unique opportunity to act on behalf of others, on behalf of the weak, the isolated, the powerless, and the least brethren. Protestant communication could be a place for news and opinions where we find which otherwise has no chance to be public. I call this deputyship or advocacy in practice," unquote. That has been one famous purpose of Christian communication, to give a voice to those who don't have one, to act on behalf of the least siblings. There are many concrete examples for that. Christian journalists report from contexts which were otherwise would not be reported on. Christian news editors push stories of people at the margins of society. To act for and on behalf of the least of these has been seen as the task for Christian communication under conditions of mass media. Can it be the task for digital theology too? This is the question I want to address in the next 16 to 17 minutes. And in order to do so, I will make it a little more concrete what it means to talk on behalf of the least. Then I will expose this orientation to a post-colonial re-lecture confronted with digital media and explain two impulses from there for digital theology. So let me start with the basic orientation and its specification. Who are the least? The basic idea in Geisendörfer's quote is the orientation towards advocacy. Person A acts on behalf of B. Implicit to this relationship is a position of power, namely A's power to act on behalf of someone. In our case, to publish or to communicate. Geisendörfer's notion of advocacy binds this power to be used on behalf of the least. Who are the least? That's disputed very much itself. So I like to take a concept from social ethics and social teachings to make this a little bit more clear. That's the concept of relative poverty. Poverty then names the lack of participation in material resources, but also in social life and political decision-making. Relative poverty is not absolute lack of these means of participation, but is about a contextually relative lack of participation. On this line of thinking, Christian communication aims at advocacy for those who lack participation. And this corresponds to liberation theology's option for the poor. While liberation theology, political and public theology have formulated a bunch of theological reasons for this option, from biblical exegesis to Christology to a theology of the cross, it remains highly ambivalent when turned to a northwestern position of power. On the one hand, the orientation towards advocacy can be good and liberating and orient praxis towards a more just society and church. On the other hand, it can turn into something paternalistic, and particularly post-colonial studies have highlighted this paternalistic tendency. Hence, I come to number 3, post-colonial perspective, a post-colonial relecture of this orientation. Particularly works from the so-called post-colonial studies have highlighted the paternalistic and problematic tendencies of advocacy. In her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak has shown how subaltern voices are silenced, particularly where Western intellectuals want to let them speak. On this background, I want to briefly name 3 problematic mechanisms about which I have learned from Spivak's and Stefan Silver's work. And to illustrate them, just imagine the example of a news report. There is a journalist who tries to fulfill the task of advocacy and give a certain group a voice. In this example, let's say poor, less well-off high school students. He tries to give them voice and voice the social and political problems they have. And he does that in a longer article in a newspaper. Which problems do appear from a post-colonial perspective? Well, first of all, the problem or the mechanism of assimilation plays a role. The report can be understood as an act of advocacy insofar as it tries to give those students a voice and make their situation and problems public. But in many examples, the students in those articles do not have a voice on their own. They are represented by teachers, by social workers, by academic experts or politicians who talk about them. That's what Spivak calls assimilation. Not their own voice, not their own perspective is heard, but it is assimilated to the expert's voice. Second, essentialization. In a news report like this, a group of people will be identified with one feature. They are reduced to being examples of poverty. And this lens becomes more important than what they would have to say. Particularly interesting in this case are also talk shows where you have people casted to a certain role and essentialized to that role. You have somebody who speaks as an expert and somebody who speaks as a victim, and that already ties that person to the role of the victim, and that's exactly how essentializing works in those media contexts. Thirdly, but even where the students have a voice on their own, othering is often a problem. The journalist takes on what Spivak calls the mask of absent non-representers. But she or he still determines the framework and picks the quote. The journalist presents the voice of the poor students, and he presents us not as equal, but as the voice of those who are victims to a social process. He presents them as the voice of the other, already positioned as the other, not as an equal expert sitting at the table. Mechanisms like these and other mechanisms form what one could call the dilemma of advocacy. The powerful journalist can give a voice to the poor and can lead to good consequences with this voicing. He can give, or she can give, a voice to the poor, but in doing so, the journalist silences them again. The voice of the voiceless is never the voice of the voiceless. That's why advocacy is necessary and impossible at the same time. Does this I illustrated that dilemma with the situation from mass communication, a journalist writing an article. Does that change with digitization of communication? Well, digitization has inspired dreams of a more inclusive and a more emancipative public sphere. If these dreams came true, this would solve the dilemma of advocacy. If marginalized people can directly participate in discourse, no journalistic advocacy is needed anymore. Hence, my question, has digitization made this dream come true? In the following description, I will rely on the work on Christoph Neuberger, Felix Stalder, and Andreas Hepp. And using them, I can make visible that the dream of a more participative, inclusive, and emancipative public sphere with digital media rests on the perception that the old gatekeepers from the mass media age lose their power. The journalists who could determine what becomes public are not the only ones who determine what becomes public anymore in a digital age. Most importantly, the digital media allow for many-to-many communications, allow for networks, which are socially institutionalized in social media practices, and theoretically allowed for everybody to publish. One consequence of this has often been mentioned. The former gatekeepers, the journalists and editors, lose their power. Indeed, this creates new chances for new groups to participate in the public sphere. There are examples of scandals and discussions that started with YouTube videos, and that's precisely how more of participation has worked here. On the other hand, newer contributions to the digital divide research let one think that mechanisms of exclusion have just become more subtle, but they still exist. In his book on the culture of digitality, Felix Stalder has described at least two of these gatekeeping mechanisms and called them filters. He describes them as forms of digitality: referentiality, community, and algorithms. And referentiality and community form one filter mechanism in what follows. They refer to informal and voluntary forms. Collectively, internet users work together in everyday life to assess the importance of contributions, to order them and to circulate them. They give likes, they share, and they retweet. And by doing all that, they collectively take part in the decision what becomes public and what does not become public. And algorithms play a similar role as technical procedures. They help to select and prioritize contributions users get to see. Among others, these mechanisms work as gatekeepers. If a certain meme is neither shared nor liked, nor picked by an algorithm to be shown to someone in first row, it will pass unseen. These new gatekeepers differ from the old ones in at least one point. They are harder to address. The broadcasting station has a mailbox. The collective of all Instagram users does not. The power of these algorithms is less transparent. How powerful and oppressive they are is shown, for instance, by Safian Noble's work on the algorithms of oppression. To sum up, digital transformation transforms the dilemma of advocacy more than it solves it. The old gatekeepers lose power, which gives the least of these more chances to make their own voice heard. But whether they are actually heard publicly depends on new and less transparent gatekeepers. I come to the last section, consequences for digital theology. Undoubtedly, the issue of participation and exclusion as well as the purpose of empowering for participation, are highly relevant to digital theology insofar as they are connected to many fields of digital theology. Towards the end of my paper, I want to highlight one specific aspect. To my view, digital theology is not only about digital communication in other parts of society, such as religious life, education, politics. It is also about the part of society that theology is itself as an academic discipline. Theology is discussed and taught in specific social contexts at universities or other institutions. Theology as academic discipline uses different digital media for its research and its discourses, from email to Zoom right now, from databases to search engines. All that has an influence on who does theology, how they do theology, and what questions and solutions they come up with. Hence, similar to digital humanities, digital theology is about the digitization of theology as academic discipline itself. That means that the ambivalent orientation towards advocacy and participation is relevant for digital theology too. And since digitization does not solve the dilemma of advocacy, it needs ways of dealing with this dilemma. Inspired from Mark Lewis Taylor's scholar in postcolonial studies, inspired by Mark Lewis Taylor's suggestions, I want to make two concluding suggestions how this could work. A digital theology that takes up the task of advocacy needs to be honest about its own standpoint and interconnectedness. It does not try to make the practices and resources invisible that constitute itself. That means it contextualizes itself as far as possible. My own theology is not universally valid or universal, but it is deeply intertwined with my German context, with the context of the church I grew up in, with the church and state relationship in my context, with my own class and upbringing, with my privileges as a white male, and my experiences as a queer person. And last but not least, with the media my peers and I use. To be honest about this contextuality brings theology on an eye-to-eye level. Second, a digital theology that takes up the task of advocacy needs to be self-critical. It will not avoid the dilemma of advocacy, but it can be sensitive to its mechanism. I dare to be an advocate. Where do I stereotype? Where do I essentialize? Where do I assimilate others into my own perspective? At least from a position of being privileged, a prophetic critique that is truly empowering needs to start with a prophetic self-critique. Thank you for your attention.